The desert had a way of swallowing time. Days blended together beneath a pitiless sun, and the horizon stretched on forever, mocking the weary traveler with mirages of water that never came. For 3 days, the young woman stumbled across the wasteland. Her lips cracked, her throat raw, and her limbs heavy with fatigue. Each step felt like it might be her last. She had set out with determination, chasing a path she thought would bring her closer to freedom. But the desert had other plans. The wind whipped sand into her eyes. The ground burned her feet even through worn shoes, and the silence pressed in like an invisible weight. At night, the cold bit at her bones, reminding her that even the stars could not be trusted to comfort a soul alone. By the 3rd day, she was past the point of prayer. Hope had drained from her the way sweat had left her body. She walked with the strange clarity of someone who no longer feared death, only longed for rest. Then, when her knees threatened to buckle completely, she saw it. A flicker of movement, against the endless tan and gold of the earth. Smoke. At first she thought it another cruel mirage, but as she blinked grit from her lashes, the truth sharpened. A thin gray column rising into the sky. Where there was smoke, there was fire. Where there was fire, there were people. Her legs carried her forward with newfound desperation, stumbling over rocks and cactus roots. The closer she drew, the clearer the signs became. Hoofprints pressed into the dirt, the faint echo of laughter. Carried on the wind, and finally, structures of hide and wood, clustered together like an oasis born of human hands. An Apache settlement. The woman froze at the edge of the encampment, fear rooting her in place. Stories had been told, some whispered with awe, others with venom, about Apache warriors, giants of the earth, fierce protectors of their people, and merciless to intruders. She was an outsider, ragged and trembling, with nothing to offer but her own desperate need for survival. Would they turn her away, or worse? A group of women noticed her first. Their chatter stilled, their eyes narrowing in curiosity rather than hostility. One rose, her long braids glinting in the sun, and called out in a language the stranger could not fully understand. The sound was sharp, but not cruel, a question more than a threat. The woman's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "Please." Water. That single word carried across the camp like a pebble rippling water. Children darted out from behind their mothers, pointing and whispering. A pair of young men appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, their bows slung across their backs, watching her with measured caution, and then him. From the shadow of a lodge, he emerged, a man unlike any she had ever seen. He towered above the rest, shoulders wide as a bear's, his chest scarred by years of battle. His presence was commanding, his silence heavier than any shouted command. A warrior, a leader. His eyes, dark and unyielding, fixed on her with the intensity of someone who had seen too many strangers to trust easily. The woman's heart hammered. She wanted to turn and run, but her body betrayed her. Too weak, too spent. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the dust. The last thing she remembered before darkness edged her vision was his shadow falling over her, vast and protective. Hands lifted her, surprisingly gentle for their size, and the scent of smoke and leather filled her senses. Though she drifted, in and out of consciousness, she felt the cool touch of a clay bowl against her lips, water spilling into her parched mouth. Relief washed over her like rain on desert stone. She had stumbled upon the heart of the Apache, and in that moment, whether it meant salvation or doom, she knew her fate had been forever altered. When the young woman awoke, the world was softer than the desert she had left behind. She lay inside a lodge of stretched hide, warm and dimly lit by the glow of a small fire at its center. The air smelled of cedar smoke and herbs. Her lips, though still cracked, no longer bled. Her throat, though raw, no longer burned. Someone had cared enough to tend her, to keep her alive when she had been ready to surrender to death. But she was not alone. He sat in the shadows, silent and still, the giant Apache warrior. His broad back leaned against the lodge wall, his arms folded across his chest as though he were carved from the same stone that framed the canyons. His long black hair caught the firelight in faint bronze streaks. His gaze, when she dared to meet it, was steady and unreadable. He did not speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy yet strangely comforting. He watched her with the intensity of a hawk, and though his eyes held no warmth, neither did they hold cruelty. It was the look of a man accustomed to weighing strangers, deciding whether they meant harm or sought refuge. The woman shifted under, the blanket draped over her body, unsure whether to thank him, fear him, or both. Her voice rasped when she finally spoke. You saved me." The warrior did not answer. His jaw tightened slightly, but he did not move. Outside, the sounds of camp life stirred, women grinding maize, children laughing, the thud of axes splitting wood. Yet inside, the silence remained. Only the crackle of fire dared to speak between them. At length, the lodge flap rustled, and a boy slipped inside. He was perhaps 8 or 9, with sharp, curious eyes and a quickness to his movements, as though every moment brimmed with energy. When he saw her awake, his face lit with relief. He hurried to her side, offering a small clay cup filled with water. "Drink," he said in careful English. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. The water slid down her throat, soothing, life-giving. She whispered her thanks. The boy grinned, proud of himself for bridging the gap between her tongue and theirs. Then he glanced at the warrior, his father, and his smile softened. "He watched you," the boy said, nodding toward the giant. "All night, no sleep." The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly at his son, but still he did not speak. The boy only laughed at his father's silence, as though this was nothing new. The woman's chest tightened. He had kept vigil while she lay unconscious, guarding a stranger who might have brought danger to his people. She looked again at his face, searching for a trace of why, but the warrior revealed nothing. As the days unfolded, the pattern repeated itself. Each time she awoke, she found him nearby, sometimes sitting in the lodge, sometimes standing at a distance outside, always watchful. He spoke not a word to her, but his presence was constant, as solid as the earth beneath her feet. When she limped weakly into the sunlight on the second day, the children darted around her in play, some bold enough to tug at her skirts before dashing off in laughter. The women eyed her with open curiosity, some cautious, some kind, and always she felt the weight of his gaze. From across the camp, from the edge of the fields, or from the shadows of the lodge, he was there. It unsettled her at first, that relentless watching. But the longer it went on, the more she realized it was not suspicion alone. There was something else in his eyes, something unspoken, unreadable, but undeniably human. And though he had yet to say a single word to her, she began to understand that the silence between them was not emptiness. It was a language of its own. On the third morning, she woke to laughter. The sound was bright and wild, rolling through the camp like a bird's song. It startled her at first. Laughter was a sound she had not heard in weeks, maybe months. It seemed almost out of place, in a world that had been nothing but sand, silence, and suffering. When she stepped outside the lodge, shielding her eyes against the blaze of the rising sun, she found the boy waiting. The same one who had brought her water. The same one who had spoken for his father when the warrior himself remained silent, his dark eyes wide and sharp, fixed on her with the kind of curiosity that only children could carry without shame. He tilted his head and grinned. "You walk now." "Good." The woman smiled faintly, though her body still ached from her dessert. Ordeal. Yes. Better, she whispered, her voice rough but stronger than before. The boy stood straighter, puffing out his chest as if to say, "I helped." His hair, long like his father's, fell across his shoulders, but his face was lively where the giant's was stern. There was no silence in him. He brimmed with words, with questions, with fearless delight. He tugged at her hand suddenly. "Come. Eat." She followed, half out of amusement, half because she didn't have the strength to argue. The boy led her to a circle where women pounded maize with smooth stone tools, their rhythmic movements keeping time with the heartbeat of the camp. One woman glanced up at the stranger, then at the boy, and said something in Apache that made the other women chuckle. The boy rolled his eyes in exaggerated annoyance, earning more laughter. He pressed a small cake of roasted corn into the woman's hands. "Eat," he repeated firmly, like a command. She obeyed, the food coarse but warm, grounding her in the moment. The boy watched, satisfied. Then he sat cross-legged at her feet, squinting up at her as if trying to solve a puzzle. "What is your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated. Her name felt like a fragile thread tying her to a world she wasn't sure she wanted to remember. Still, she answered quietly. He repeated it carefully, his accent rounding the edges until it sounded new, reborn, in his mouth. "Good name," he declared. Then, tapping his chest, he told her his own. The name carried strength, but the mischievous gleam in his eyes made it clear that though he bore the legacy of a warrior, he still carried the heart of a child. "Your father," she began, glancing toward the tall figure in the distance who watched them, arms folded, expression unreadable. He does not speak." The boy followed her gaze and chuckled. "He speaks, but not to everyone. He speaks with his eyes. You will learn." She frowned. "And what do his eyes say now?" The boy didn't hesitate. "That he does not trust you yet. But he will. He is waiting." His honesty, so matter-of-fact, made her laugh softly for the first time in what felt like years. The boy grinned wider, pleased to have coaxed such a sound from her. For the rest of the morning, he shadowed her steps. He pointed out the different lodges, the drying racks hung with strips of meat, the horses tied near the edge of the camp. He named each one in English, sometimes adding the Apache word, watching closely to see if she could repeat it. When she stumbled, he corrected her with exaggerated patience, puffing himself up as if he were her teacher. By the time the sun hung overhead, she realized something startling. She felt safe. Not because the giant warrior kept his silent vigil, but because of the boy with the fierce eyes and boundless energy. His presence wrapped around her like a shield she hadn't known she needed. And for the first time since she had stumbled into this place, she wondered, not just if she could survive here, but if she might belong. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, a strange and fragile rhythm that both comforted and unsettled her. Morning light crept into the lodge, warming her face until she stirred awake. The boy was always the first to greet her, bounding in with boundless energy, tugging her toward whatever new thing he wanted to show. And always, without fail, his father lingered somewhere near. The giant warrior never addressed her directly. He did not ask her name, nor question how she had come stumbling into their land half dead. He never offered her food or spoke a single word of welcome. Yet his eyes never left her. He watched her when she sat by the fire, when she helped grind maize under the women's instruction, even when she walked to the edge of camp at dusk to breathe in the cool desert air. It should have unsettled her, this silent scrutiny. And in the beginning, it did. But the longer it stretched on, the more she came to understand that his silence was not absence. It was a kind of presence more solid than words. His gaze did not feel like a knife at her back, but rather a weight beside her, grounding her. Still, the silence pressed against her at times, demanding questions she had no answers for. Why did he not speak? Was it mistrust, disdain, or something deeper that she could not yet name? On the second day of her recovery, she dared to test the unspoken boundary. As she sat by the fire, weaving reeds into a crude mat with one of the elder women, she caught the warrior's eyes across the flames. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, 2, 3, longer than comfort allowed. He did not look away. Something flickered there, something unreadable, as though he was speaking in a language she had not yet learned. She lowered her eyes quickly, her pulse racing. The boy, oblivious to the tension, plopped down beside her with a stick in his hand. He began to draw in the dirt, crude shapes of horses and warriors, the lines jagged but full of life. He pointed at one towering figure, arms wide like a mountain. "Father," he announced proudly. Then he drew a smaller figure beside it, stick-thin but upright. He looked at her with a mischievous smile. "You," she blinked, startled. "Me?" The boy nodded, dark eyes gleaming. "Yes, you. Father. Watch you." He mimed the posture perfectly, arms crossed, gaze steady, lips silent. She couldn't help but laugh, clapping a hand over her mouth to stifle it. The warrior's brow furrowed across the fire, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of amusement tug at the corner of his mouth. It was gone in an instant, buried beneath the granite of his expression, but she had seen it. That night, lying on the mat inside the lodge, she could not sleep. The camp had grown quiet, only the whispers of wind and the faint howls of coyotes on the horizon. She turned toward the entrance and saw him again, a dark silhouette just beyond the flap. He stood guard, not just over her, she knew, but over all his people. Still, she could not shake the thought that his presence outside the lodge had something to do with her as well. And so, she waited. For 3 days she waited for him to speak, to ask her who she was, where she had come from, what her place among them might be. Waited for him to break the silence that pressed between them like a taut bowstring. But no words came. Only the steady gaze, the watchful eyes, and the knowledge that something was being measured, weighed. By the end of the 3rd day, she understood this much. He was not a man who rushed. He was a man who carried centuries of tradition and scars. If he would speak, it would not be quickly. If he would trust, it would not be lightly. Until then, she was caught in the waiting game, caught between the boy's laughter and the warrior's silence, between belonging and being an outsider, between fear and something startlingly close to hope. By the 4th morning, the young woman began to notice the way the women of the camp looked at her. Their gazes were not hostile, at least not all of them, but they carried the sharp edge of curiosity, the kind that could cut as easily as it could embrace. They did not treat her as an enemy, nor as a guest. She was something in between, a puzzle piece that had not yet found where it fit. While she worked alongside them, learning to grind maize until her arms ached, or to twist sinew into cord with clumsy fingers, she felt the weight of their eyes. Some of the younger girls watched her openly, whispering to each other behind small smiles. The elder women, wise with years and weathered by sun, studied her with more caution, as though she were a flame that might flicker into danger if left unchecked. It was during one of these afternoons, as she knelt beside a woman who was teaching her to sew buckskin, that the whispers began to reach her. They spoke in Apache, the words tumbling too quickly for her to understand, but the tone carried meaning, even without translation. The women's voices rose and fell in a rhythm of amusement, sometimes glancing in her direction, sometimes toward the towering figure who lingered at the edge of camp. She followed their eyes and found him again. Always him. The silent warrior, arms folded across his broad chest, watching. One of the women laughed softly, shaking her head as she threaded a needle. Another murmured something that made them all smile knowingly. The young woman felt heat rise in her cheeks. She did not know the words, but she did not need to. She understood enough. They were speaking of him and her. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She bowed her head, pretending to focus on her stitches, though her hands trembled. The needle pricked her finger, a tiny bead of blood welling up. One of the women clicked her tongue in mild disapproval and bound the finger quickly with a strip of cloth. Then, in halting English, she said with a mischievous glint in her eye, "He watch you. Always watch." The women chuckled again. The young woman's breath caught in her throat. She glanced toward the warrior, only to find his gaze already fixed on her. This time, she did not look away. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to shrink, until there was only the fire between them, her quickened pulse, and the gravity of his dark eyes. The women noticed. They exchanged looks heavy with meaning, their whispers softer now, but tinged with satisfaction, as if they had seen this kind of thing before. Later, as she fetched water from a nearby stream with two of the women, one leaned close and murmured something in Apache that she could not understand, but her smile was teasing, her tone unmistakable. When the stranger frowned in confusion, the woman tapped her chest, then gestured toward the camp where the warrior stood in the distance. The implication was clear. The young woman shook her head quickly, embarrassed, almost frightened by the suggestion. "No," she whispered. "Not me, not." Her words trailed off, lost in the rush of the stream. But when she returned to camp, the boy greeted her with his usual energy, tugging at her hand and chattering about a game he wanted to show her. And behind him, as always, his father stood. In silence, eyes following her every step. The whispers of the women clung to her like smoke. They stirred questions she had not dared to ask herself. Why did his eyes linger so long? Why did his presence stir something in her chest that was not fear, not distrust, but something far more dangerous? That night, as she lay on her mat, the women's laughter echoed in her ears. She closed her eyes, but even in dreams, she could not escape the image of his gaze, unyielding, silent, and perhaps, just perhaps, longing. By the time the third night came, the campfire burned low, and shadows danced like restless spirits across the earth. The day had been long, filled with chores that left her fingers raw and her body sore. Yet she did not mind the ache. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from doing, from belonging, even if only on the edges. She sat near the fire, her knees drawn close, staring into the flames as they licked at the dry wood. Around her, the camp had grown quieter. Children drifted into their mother's arms, elders murmured softly in the dark, and even the horses at the edge of the encampment had settled. But the boy was still awake. He appeared suddenly at her side, dropping onto the ground with a soft thud, his small body brimming with restless energy. His eyes shone in the firelight, fierce and unafraid. He had always carried that boldness, that spark, as if the desert itself had carved him from its sun and stone. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply studied her, his little brow furrowed in thought, as if weighing words too big for his years. Then, with the sudden bluntness only a child could carry, he spoke. "Will you marry my daddy instead?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. Her breath caught. She blinked at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What?" The boy repeated himself, slower this time, each syllable pronounced with care, as though he wanted to make sure there was no mistake. "Will you marry my daddy instead?" The fire popped loudly, a spark leaping into the night. She stared at him, utterly undone, her mind scrambling for an answer. Marry. She had not thought of marriage in years, not since her old life had crumbled to dust. And now, here, in the heart of a people not her own, a child dared to ask her, a question that struck deeper than any knife. She tried to laugh it off, her voice trembling. "Why would you ask me such a thing?" The boy tilted his head, unfazed. "Because he looks at you. Always. And you look at him." Heat rushed into her face. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was mistaken. But the words tangled on her tongue, refusing to form. "He does not speak," she whispered, half to herself. The boy shrugged. "He speaks with his eyes. I told you. You just don't hear yet." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She glanced toward the warrior, who stood just beyond the circle of firelight. As always, he was there, watching, silent, unyielding. His figure was carved in shadow, but she felt his presence as surely as she felt the ground beneath her. The boy leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He is strong. He is good. He fights for us. He carries many scars. But inside—" His small hand tapped his chest firmly. "Inside, he is not stone. He is my father." The woman swallowed hard, her throat dry, though she had water enough now. "And you think he wants me?" The boy grinned, a mischievous flash of teeth. "I know it. He would never say it. But I know." She shook her head, more to clear her thoughts than in disagreement. Yet the seed had been planted, and already it was taking root inside her. The boy's boldness, his fierce little heart, had given voice to something she had been too afraid to name herself. When she looked back at the warrior, their eyes met across the flames, and this time she did not look away. The boy noticed, his smile widened with triumph. To him, the answer was already given. That night, long after the boy's laughter had faded into dreams and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she remained awake. The desert was vast in its silence, but inside her chest there was only noise, questions tumbling over one another, the boy's words echoing again and again. "Will you marry my daddy instead?" She turned on her mat, restless, glancing toward the lodge entrance where a faint shadow shifted in the moonlight. He was there again, as always, silent, watching. Finally, she could bear the weight of the unspoken, no longer. Gathering what little courage the desert had not already stripped from her, she rose quietly and stepped outside. The air was cool, a balm against her flushed skin. He stood at the edge of the lodge, tall and unmovable, as if rooted to the earth itself. His eyes met hers instantly, sharp and unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The moon traced his, scars in silver, and she realized how many there were, across his chest, his arms, his face. Each one a story, each one a survival. The words tumbled from her lips before she could stop them. "Why do you watch me?" It was the first time she had dared to confront him directly. Her voice shook, but she held her ground. The warrior's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might turn away, retreat into silence once more. But then, for the first time, his deep voice rumbled into the night. "Because I must know." She blinked. The sound of his voice startled her. It was low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who did not waste words. "Know what?" she whispered. His eyes searched hers, fierce, but not cruel. "If you are danger, or if you are gift." Her breath caught. His honesty was sharp, cutting through her defenses. "A gift?" she echoed, almost disbelieving. He inclined his head, though his expression remained grave. "My people have suffered for every stranger. Strangers bring fire, guns, sorrow. I cannot let you near until I know." His words stung, but beneath them lay something else, something she hadn't expected. Care. Not just for his people, but for her as well. "You kept me alive," she said softly. "You could have left me in the desert." "I do not leave the dying," he replied simply. The silence between them stretched again, but it was different now. Not empty, full. His eyes softened, just slightly, and for the first time she saw not only the warrior, but the man beneath. "You think I do not see," he said at last. "I see how you try. With the women, with the boy. You do not hide your fear, but you do not run either." He paused, his voice rougher now, as if it cost him something to speak. "It is. More courage than many." Her throat tightened. She had not expected him to notice her small efforts, her fumbling attempts to fit into a world that was not hers. He shifted his weight, his hand brushing against the scar along his chest. "But I am not like others. My body carries battles. My spirit carries ghosts. I am too scarred, too old, too heavy with burden." The vulnerability in his tone startled her more than any show of strength could have. This was a man who had carried his people, his son, his past, and yet he believed himself unworthy of being chosen. For a long time she could not speak. The moonlight, the desert wind, the faint crackle of the dying fire, everything seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she whispered, "And yet, your son asked me to marry you." His eyes widened ever so slightly. For a man so stone-faced, the flicker of surprise was a revelation. His gaze broke from hers for the first time, as though the boy's boldness had cut deeper than any blade. "He should not have said that," the warrior muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" she asked gently. His silence was answer enough, and in that silence she realized the truth. He wanted to ask. But the weight of his scars, his age, his ghosts, they bound him tighter than chains. The warrior's heart was not stone. It was a heart that had been broken, battered, and hidden behind silence. And now, piece by piece, it was revealing itself to her. The night stretched long after his words faded into silence. The woman stood with the cool desert wind brushing against her skin, her heart unsteady. The warrior had spoken at last, and though his words were few, they were heavier than any she had ever heard. Too scarred, too old, too heavy with burden. She turned those words over in her mind again and again. They carried not arrogance, but doubt, the kind of doubt born from pain and long years of carrying more than one man should ever have to bear. When she returned to her mat, she did not sleep. She lay staring at the lodge ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of the wind through the hides, the soft breathing of the boy beside her. And she thought of her own past, the long road that had led her here, the betrayals and losses, the loneliness that had hollowed her out. She had run from one place to another, searching for something she could not name, until the desert had nearly claimed her. And then, him. This man of silence, this warrior who watched instead of spoke, who judged with his eyes but did not turn. Her away. He had carried her when she could not stand, fed her when she could not feed herself. He had stood between her and the unknown, his presence a wall no storm could break. The next day, she carried those thoughts with her like hidden embers, glowing quietly inside her. The women continued their whispers, their sidelong glances filled with amusement. She felt their questions pressing against her, unspoken, but heavy. The boy darted around her with endless joy, tugging at her sleeve, teaching her words in his tongue, weaving her into his world without hesitation, and always his father. Silent, watchful, unyielding. Yet now, after hearing his voice, she could no longer see him only as a wall of stone. She saw the fractures, the man beneath the scars. By midday, she found herself alone at the stream, kneeling to wash the grit from her hands. The water was cool, soothing, yet her reflection unsettled her. She no longer looked like the woman who had stumbled into the desert, hollow-eyed and ready to die. There was color in her cheeks again, strength in her limbs. Life had returned, and she wondered, was it because of him? The question stirred something fierce inside her. She had never depended on anyone, not truly, not since the world had turned its back on her. And yet when she thought of leaving this place, of walking away into the desert again, her chest tightened with fear, not of death, but of loss. That evening, as the fire roared and the people gathered to share food and stories, she felt the decision blooming within her like a seed cracking open in the soil. The boy leaned against her side, his small hand wrapped around hers with the trust of a child who already saw her as family. His laughter filled the night, bright and unshaken. And across the fire the warrior sat, his gaze meeting hers. This time, she did not look away. She let him see her choice in her eyes, though she had not yet spoken it aloud. She let him see that she was not afraid of his scars, his silence, his burdens, because she carried her own. When the boy tugged her hand and whispered, "You will stay, won't you?" She felt the truth rising inside her like dawn breaking over the horizon. She squeezed his small fingers and nodded slowly, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, I will stay." The boy beamed, triumphant. The women whispered. The warrior's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened just for her. The choice was made, not out of pity, not out of desperation, but out of something stronger, something she had thought she had lost forever, the possibility of love. That night, the fire burned higher than usual, its flames leaping and twisting toward the starlit sky. The camp gathered around it as they did each evening, but there was a weight in the air now, an anticipation that hummed just beneath the laughter and stories. The woman sat among the others, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding like a drum. She could feel the eyes of the women on her, their whispers no longer subtle. The children darted around the fire in play, their shadows stretching long and wild. And as always, the warrior stood at the edge of the circle, his gaze fixed upon her, unflinching. She thought of the boy's words. She thought of her own choice whispered in the quiet of the stream. And she knew that silence could not carry this decision forever. It needed to be spoken, not only to him, but to all who watched and wondered. The boy must have sensed it too, for he clambered into her lap with the boldness only a child could possess. He tugged her hand, and then looked across the fire at his father, his small voice carrying clearly in the night air. "She will stay," he announced proudly, as if declaring victory in a game. The camp stilled. Conversations hushed. Eyes turned from the boy to the woman, then to the warrior. Her cheeks burned under the weight of so many gazes, but she did not falter. She met the warrior's eyes, and though her throat trembled, she spoke. "Yes, I will. Stay." The words felt like stepping off a cliff, and yet instead of falling she felt herself caught, grounded, steadied by the silence that followed. The boy grinned wide, his triumph complete. He leapt from her lap and ran to his father, tugging at his massive hand. "She will stay," he repeated with glee, his voice brighter now, almost singing. "She will stay with us." The warrior's gaze lingered on her, dark and steady. Slowly, he stepped forward, into the circle of firelight. The flickering flames painted his scars in gold and shadow, revealing the story of every battle he had endured. His presence filled the space, commanding yet humble, strong yet strangely uncertain. For a moment he said nothing. The camp waited, breathless. Then, in his deep, deliberate voice, he spoke. "If you choose to stay," he said, his words measured, "you do not stay a stranger. You stay as one of us. My people will be your people. My fire will be your fire. My son," he glanced at the boy, who beamed up at him, "will be your son also." The woman's chest tightened. She had expected to be tolerated, perhaps, accepted in time. She had not expected this, an invitation not to linger at the edges but to step into the very heart of their circle. She rose slowly, her knees trembling, and crossed the space between them. The fire crackled, the sparks leaping skyward as if in celebration. She stood before him, smaller by far but unafraid, and when she reached out, her hand slipped into his, her fingers threading through the calloused strength of his palm. Gasps rippled through the women. The boy clapped his hands, his laughter ringing like bells. The warrior's grip tightened around hers, firm, certain. His eyes, dark and unyielding, softened in that instant, revealing the truth that his silence had always guarded. He had wanted this. Perhaps from the very moment he carried her from the desert dust, he had wanted this. The firelight danced around them, sealing their union not with words, not with ceremony, but with the simple truth of two hands clasped, a child's joy, and a tribe's watchful blessing. That night, under the vast Apache sky, she was no longer a wanderer, no longer a stranger. She was his, and he was hers. The desert was quiet the next morning, its vastness softened by the rising sun. The woman stepped out of the lodge and felt the cool earth beneath her bare feet, a sensation that no longer felt foreign but grounding. The camp stirred slowly around her, women tending fires, men preparing horses, children already chasing each other through the dust. But now she was not only an onlooker. She was part of it. The boy ran to her first, as he always did, his small hand slipping into hers as naturally as if it had always belonged there. His smile was brighter than the sunrise, his laughter light as he pulled her toward the center of camp. "Come," he said. "Father is waiting." And there he was. The warrior stood tall, his scars glinting faintly in the morning light. His presence, once intimidating, now steadied her. He nodded to her, not in command, not in question, but in acknowledgement. A partner's nod. For the first time since she had stumbled, half dead, into this place, she felt something settle deep in her chest, belonging. The women still whispered, their eyes curious, some amused, some approving. The elders watched her with solemn interest, weighing the new shape their people had taken with her addition. And though she knew trust would not be won in a single night, she also knew that trust grew from choice, and she had chosen. That morning, she carried water with the women. She knelt in the dust beside them, her skirts gathering earth, her hands raw from the heavy pots. Yet when one of the women handed her a woven basket filled with corn, it was not given as a test this time, but as a task shared. That small gesture meant more than words. By midday, she walked beside the boy as he led her to the horses. He chattered in both English and Apache, proud to teach her his language, proud to claim her as his. She stumbled over the words, and he laughed, but his laughter carried joy, not ridicule. The warrior joined them, his shadow long in the sun. He adjusted her grip on the reins with careful hands, his touch firm but not unkind. When their eyes met, there was no need for speech. She read his meaning easily now. "I will not let you fall," and she believed him. That night, as the tribe gathered again around the fire, the atmosphere was different. No longer was she the outsider everyone studied with wary glances. No longer was she the woman waiting for judgment. She sat beside the warrior, the boy nestled between them, and when the drums began to beat, she felt the rhythm not as an intrusion, but as something that pulsed inside her own chest. The boy clapped along, his laughter rising into the smoke-filled night. The women sang, their voices weaving through the desert air, like threads binding the people together. And the warrior, silent as ever, rested his hand lightly against hers where it lay on the ground. It was not a grand gesture, but it was everything. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of the drums, the songs, the boy's joy wash over her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not think of the life she had lost or the loneliness she had carried. She thought only of the firelight, the strong hand at her side, and the boy who had given her a family with a single question. This was not the end of her journey. It was the beginning. A beginning carved not out of desperation but out of choice. Not out of chance but out of courage. A woman's resilience, a warrior's strength, and a child's unshakable faith had come together in this unlikely union. And under the endless stars of the Apache sky, she understood. Sometimes the desert stripped everything away, only to give back more than one dared to dream.